Welcome to Lewis Clark State College's 38th Annual Stegner Lecture. My name is Jennifer Anderson, and I'm the Faculty Advisor for Talking River Review, our college's student-run literary journal. Created in 1982 and named after writer and environmentalist Wallace Stegner, Lewis Clark State College's Stegner Lecture has long been a literary and cultural highlight for the LCSC community, featuring discussions about the writer's relationship with the physical and psychological territories in which they reside. Tonight, we are honored to have poet and naturalist Elizabeth Bradfield speak about decolonizing the exploration narrative and also read from her 2019 book, Toward Antarctica. As many of you know, we invited Elizabeth to present this lecture last March, but had to postpone because of the pandemic. Customarily, Stegner lecturers spend a couple of days with us here at LCSC, visiting classes and interacting with students and faculty alike. This year, thanks to technology and Elizabeth's generous flexibility, we have been able to continue these class visits remotely, which I know everyone has greatly appreciated. Stegner lectures are also typically held on campus in venues like the Silverthorne Theater or the Center for Arts and History. And though this is not presently possible for obvious reasons, we are extremely grateful that we can carry on our cherished college tradition in a virtual setting. Hopefully, we will not have any technical difficulties, but if we do, please stay tuned in and thank you in advance for your patience. Kate Laws, a senior at LCSC studying creative writing and publishing arts, will introduce Elizabeth Bradfield. After the reading, there will be a Q&A, which Professor Kimberly Tolson and I will moderate. So please send your questions via YouTube chat. Now, I hope you are all bundled up somewhere comfy with a tasty warm beverage in hand, and I will turn it over to Kate.
Thank you, Jennifer. Elizabeth Bradfield grew up in Tacoma, Washington, where she spent a great deal of time on the water, even as a 13-year-old traveling around Puget Sound solo on a little runaround boat. She graduated from the University of Washington with degrees in English and Women's Studies. After that, she earned an MFA from the University of Alaska, Anchorage. In the 1990s, she began working as a naturalist and marine educator, and in 2004, began working on ecotourism ships. In 2005, she founded Broadsided Press, the mission of which is to help people put literature and art into public spaces in their communities. She has been awarded the Audre Lorde Prize from the Publishing Triangle, was a finalist for a Lambda Literary Award, and the James Laughlin Award from the Academy of American Poets. She has also received the Stegner Fellowship from Stanford University and a Breadloaf Scholarship. Currently, she lives on Cape Cod and is an associate professor in the English department at Brandeis University and is co-director of the Creative Writing Program. She also continues her work as a naturalist, guide, and biology field researcher. In her collection, Toward Antarctica, Bradfield says she had not been able to write while working as a naturalist until her first time working in Antarctica. The longer voyages and days at sea allowed for a bit more downtime, and the continent itself was unique in that it allowed her to ground truth in what she'd written in her 2010 collection of poems, Approaching Ice. Inspired by Matsuo Basho and the Haibun style of poetry, Toward Antarctica utilizes prose style interspersed with haiku, triplets, and couplets to great effect. Related facts are given at the bottom of many of the pages like a footnote, which assists in immersing the reader into the subject by educating them on what is being written about. The poems take us on the journey with the poet, so as we read, we too come closer to the final destination and back again. We experience the journey as if it is ours, and yet I'm certain it can't compare to the real thing, as the photos included throughout the book are stunning and gritty and beautiful. This collection is as much a sharing of this experience as it seems to be a statement about the human effect on the creatures and habitats that are encountered, not only to the wildlife and natural locations, but to one another. We have a responsibility to help when we can, and to avoid doing as much harm as possible while on our journey. And now, I'm honored to present Lewis Clark State College's 38th Annual Stegner Lecturer, Elizabeth Bradfield.
Kate, thank you so much for that generous introduction. I really appreciate it. And thank you everyone for having me here tonight. I've prepared remarks and I'm eager to read some of these to you and then also to engage in a conversation. So let me dive in. We'll see if I need my glasses or not. I think, well, we'll see. Maybe I'll use my glasses. But I really want to extend my warm thanks to Jennifer Anderson for the invitation to talk with you tonight and for all the work that she's done to connect me with the community at Lewis Clark State College. To Lauren Connolly and her poetry students for the conversation we had on Monday. And I really look forward to meeting with Gwen Sullivan's literature course next week. Those kind of conversations one-on-one with students are so rewarding and so rich and so much a part of what I love about visiting campuses and communities. And I'm glad we can continue that even as we are far apart. And I'm sorry we're not all gathered together in person. I'd really been looking forward to being on and along the river with all of you last spring, but I'm really glad that we're talking now. I was so grateful for the opportunity to delve into the questions and ideas and creative potential orbiting around this concept of the decolonialized exploration narrative, which we developed last year as we were talking about me coming to speak with you in the spring. I guess I want to begin. I'll have many beginnings. I'm a many beginning kind of person, but by saying that I'm an expert, if I'm an expert in anything, in asking questions and inhabiting contradictions. I am not a historian, a political scientist, sociologist, or literary critic, all fields which are rich with smart conversations about colonialism and exploration. But I'm a poet, and it's my job as such to map and chart and, yes, explore how ideas are lived. And as a naturalist guide, it's my job to observe and share with others the nuances of the worlds we walk through together, past and present, human and non-human. And that includes querying the implications of our presence in places as visitors. So let's begin with where we are. I am speaking to you, who listen through your relationship with Lewis Clark State College on the lands of the Nimipu people, from my settler home on the lands of the Nauset Pamut. I speak to you as a queer woman who has dedicated her life to poetry and marine ecology and mapping the emotional paths between them. And I ask questions as a fourth generation Pacific Northwesterner, a settler who has come to be a wash ashore on Cape Cod. These positions are not without deep consideration. And as I said, I'm speaking as a poet, as an artist, which means I'm always seeking new ways of seeing and understanding, new examples in the world around me of how ideas are embodied. And I'm speaking also as a naturalist guide, which means I'm someone who's comfortable with and prepared for lostness of a sort, not search party lost, but more wandering lost, and someone who seeks to choose routes to guide others that will be safe and generative, even as they might not be wholly known. And someone who realizes that people, animals, and plants have so much more to teach me. So this evening, I want to talk as a poet and a naturalist. And I hope that I have these prepared remarks, but I really hope that all of you will ask questions and think about things that you want to engage yourselves in what I'm bringing to the conversation here. I'm really eager to engage in dialogue. So I'll go on, but please think of questions that you have to answer, and I'd love to be in conversation with you. But I want to talk about questions and concerns that I have about travel, exploration, tourism, and exploitation. And I want to take time to sit together to ask questions, wrangle with potential paths forward, and acknowledge the contradictions inherent in all that we do, myself included. So I thank you for your patience with the ways in which I am still seeking answers. Much of this talk will map ideas, but I can't bear to begin without a poem. And this is the opening poem from Toward Antarctica that I'll begin with. And my book that investigates, as Kate described, my work as a guide in Antarctica, as a naturalist there, as someone who was seeking to crack open what's behind the scenes in so many polar narratives and in the place itself. So I want to show you, the book itself holds images as well as poems, as Kate mentioned. And so I want to begin with this image and with this poem. In the poem, I mention emperors, elephants, and kings. Emperors are emperor penguins, elephants are elephant seals, and kings are king penguins. Lurch upon the offer, Antarctic work. Upon paperwork and mandatory physical, resignation. Months imagining myself upon that ocean, worry, 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 wind, worry, ice, worry, stern wet landings in swell. Guffaw upon being told to bring dresses and heels, shopped and packed. Upon the ship, new crew and protocols. Upon Punta Arenas, rubbed the Fuegian's bronze toe, charm for return before I set foot. It was shined with fantastic, greasy hope. Upon Ushuaia, upon the Falklands, upon South Georgia, where it began to feel close, storied by elephants and kings. Calm seas upon each Drake crossing, each of 10. Upon sea ice, fear. Would it break to brash? Walked out, pretended comfort, did not get dropped into the Weddell Sea. Upon the shore, upon the peninsula, upon Adelie, leopard seal, emperor, snow petrel, crab eater, shag, juggle and jumble of facts. I put tongue to ice, smelled rookeries, was scoured. I have been there. I have not even come close. Peninsula, eyelash of a continent, you wink in collusion. So let me backtrack, and some of this will be an echo of what Kate mentioned, just to share a bit about my background and where I speak from when I'm talking about this work and these places and this boatness, I suppose. So starting in 2004, I've worked as a naturalist on ecotourism expedition ships. And that means ships of anywhere from 30 to 120 people, passengers, upon which the primary objective is to experience a wild place through on-site explorations facilitated by a team of experts in various fields: botany, geology, history, culture, ornithology, marine biology, and the like. I love this work. I love waking up on a boat, listening to the pitch of the engines, walking up on deck to see where we are, what the weather might bring, checking the schedule to see what I'll be doing, leading a hike, taking a Zodiac cruise, or if we'll be at sea for the day, focused on close attention to the water and shores and what walks, swims, or flies. I love offering information and a deepened experience for those new to areas that I have long held dear. I love to observe the shifts in vegetation and the history held by exposed rock. I love returning to a place season after season, year after year, and coming to know it deeply, whether it's the temperate rainforest of Southeast Alaska, Baja's rich convergence of desert and sea, the Atlantic Arctic of Baffin Island or Greenland, or Antarctica. I love it. The work, the teammates I work with, the wildlife and lands. However, I now find myself at a crossroads, partly pandemic induced and partly from other convergences. The ship-based ecotourism industry, which I first experienced in the early 1990s when I took a just out of college job as a deckhand, used to move slow and focus on loosely scheduled seeking. Now it is moving in directions that don't feel right to me. larger ships, shorter trips, more planned itineraries, more activities, and less seeking. And alongside that unease is my deepening understanding and awareness of settler colonialism, which has long whispered in different terms underneath my love of guiding and must now be brought to the fore. There's no avoiding it. And I don't want to avoid it. And I hope that in time I learn enough and the settler cultures around me change enough that the work and these beliefs come into closer alignment. We are at a very exciting and challenging moment in our considerations of ourselves as citizens, both globally and locally. Feminists, civil rights activists, ACT UP and queer radicals, eco-justice advocates, the American Indian movement, Black Lives Matter, and so many thinkers have advanced nuanced ideas of intersectionality, identity, colonialism, settlerhood, and more. Critiques of neoliberalism are part of this, as is climate crisis, and acutely notable right now, the paths of disease among our people and animals. Tonight's announced topic is decolonializing the exploration narrative. And I'd like to share with you some definitions and thinkings from scholars and writers that might help us better understand what that means and how we might move forward, and honestly, how I might move forward. So, first, what's an exploration narrative? When does travel become exploration? When does movement become exploration? Humans have always been on the move. From our origins in Africa, we have spread. Stories of South Pacific navigators crossing mind-blowing distances of water are legendary. The Roman and Mayan empires, a vast crawl of movements. Genghis Khan, wide-ranging. In the Arctic, the Thule people, ancestors of the modern Inuit, rapidly spread from Alaska to Greenland between 1100 and 1400 AD, along the way pushing out existing Dorset culture. Those who moved did so often with ambitions of gaining strength of some sort, new space to live, new sources of taxes, access to different hunting grounds or strategic routes. The Oxford English Dictionary dates the first use of exploration regarding geographical movement to 1616, which seems to me surprisingly late. There, in 1616, it's defined as thus: the action of traveling to or around an uncharted or unknown area for the purposes of discovery and gathering information. Gathering information catches my eye. For whom? For what purpose? In popular imagination today, exploration is often linked to an individualistic seeking, a solitary individual heading out in pursuit of personal goals, enlightenment, physical challenges, an expansion of one's sense of the possible. But when we look at history, exploration is clearly tied to nation building and wealth building, even if that wealth is scientific knowledge. The information is gathered from whomever funded the trip. Smithsonian, British Antarctic Survey, and funders have historically been powerful, Hudson Bay Company, been powerful rulers or institution in pursuit of resources, land, spices, silk, pigments, whales, the furs of sea otters, fur seals, foxes, or beaver. The OED's next definition of exploration makes the link even more explicit. As it says, the searching and testing of a designated area for natural resources in order to determine whether mining or extraction activities are commercially viable. Also, an instance or means of doing this, extracting. And this definition comes from 1778. What else was going on in 1778? The American Revolutionary War, James Cook's voyages in Hawaii, La Scala's opening in Milan, Linnaeus's classifications of all of the world, the heyday of American whaling in the Pacific Arctic, and the thin edge of the Industrial Revolution. My particular interest as a writer and as a naturalist is in the high latitudes, the Arctic and the Antarctic. And therefore, many of the writers and scholars that I'll turn to here are engaged there too. And it's important to note that those two polar histories, North and South, are, while both iced, very different from one another, as I'm sure many of you know. But in the Arctic, as mentioned earlier, there's a millennia of human history storying its shores. There are complex intertwinings of indigenous cultures, early Viking settlements, extraction-driven exploration, and national defense initiatives. In the Antarctic, on the other hand, there's never been an indigenous human population. The continent itself was only confirmed to have been seen 200 years ago. 200 years, it's nothing. And this was by, depending on who you count, British Edward Bradfield, Russian Fabian von Bellinghausen, or American Nathaniel Palmer. Antarctica is a place claimed by no single country, that is held by international treaty for peaceful purposes only. A very different history. But back to the exploration narrative. To define this further, to explore what it is, it's useful to turn to the hero's journey, which is a trope popularized by Joseph Campbell in the late 20th century. From Odysseus to vision quests, in the hero's journey, the hero, and usually it's a man, heads out, faces challenges or temptations, faces a life-threatening crisis, is transformed, atones for earlier hubris, for his wild assumptions that he could go forth victorious and face no harm, and then returns home humbled, better able to selflessly serve his society. In polar literature, by Southerners in particular, and by Southerners I mean those not living in the high latitudes, north or south, such tales often take the form of a rugged explorer braving inhospitable lands, testing his merit, and at last coming home to share what moral and logistical lessons were learned, what oddities, animal, meteorological, or human, he saw. Implicit in both is his relief at being back and perhaps his desire to venture again. The hero rarely has deep or meaningful connections with others, maybe a shipmate here or there, and he rarely spends time learning from peoples who make a home in the lands he travels. The hero's journey is about movement outward and return home, not about dwelling in a different space and time, not about community or communion. In the hero's journey, the I is central, tall, columnar, narrow. There are hundreds of books in this tradition, both historically and currently. And it's important to note that there are reasons the exploration narrative was popular in settled lands in the late 1800s. In his book, Unfreezing the Arctic, the scholar Andrew Soule writes, explorers' narratives were products of metropolitan societies concerned with the effects of over-civilization, a softness emerging from the urban existence that replaced life on the farm at the end of the 19th century. He writes, there is a link of exploitation, disappearance, and exploration for, as we destroy them, bison by hunting, forest by logging, we seek places away that can redeem us with their still existing wholeness. Think about this, in the late 18th century, the early 19th century, the late 1700s, the early 1800s, the expansion of industrialization, the shift in our awareness of urban and rural and wild spaces, we were really reconsidering natural resources in a lot of ways. And what's important to see here is that the idea of there, for those who travel, has never been divorced from the idea of here and its degradation. So the more here feels less than, the more there feels more than. And that's beautiful, but also problematic. And what about people? As Stoll writes, in addition to discovering new lands and riches, scientists sought to document forms of northern life that were thought to be obliterated by expanding industrial economies. So exploration and exploitation, exploration and industry, the two are linked. We don't think of them often as so, but they are very much yoked in our cultural history, especially as Americans, Europeans. When we think about the overlap of exploration and colonialism, the link becomes even more clear. Now is as good a time as any to define colonialism and also settler, a word I've used here but not explicitly defined. So colonialism, the policy or practice of acquiring full or partial political control over another country, occupying it with settlers and exploiting it economically. And settler has a more significant definition that I myself really want to acknowledge, one tied to the places I have lived in particular. When I introduced myself, I said that I was a settler, and I am. Although born in North America, my presence here is the result of the displacement from land and sovereignty of the peoples who lived and also had sovereignty or rulership and management of these lands. In many ways, my presence here is a direct result of exploration. And while I am grateful to be alive on this amazing planet, in this amazing place, I also see and acknowledge how my presence is part of a historic arc that has within it brutality and violence. Settler is defined by Laura Hurwitz and Sean Bork in their Settler Colonialism Primer as thus: anyone not Indigenous living in a settler colonial situation is a settler. Therefore, all non-Indigenous people living in what is today called the US are settlers living on stolen land. Settlers, and this is an important aside, do not all benefit equally from settler colonialism. So it's a nuanced term. I am a settler. Someone else who might not have the privilege that I have is also a settler. And I think just sitting with that and thinking about what that means without being reactionary, for me, has been a really important process that's involved a lot of internal conversations and external conversations and questions about the what next. So settler colonialism is a term that is tied more closely to the Americas than anywhere else on the planet. I quote again from the same Settler Colonialism Primer. Settler identity has been built on the denial of settlers as non-Indigenous and a rejection of Indigenous peoples' rights to the land. The initial theft of land was often justified by terra nullius, that is, viewing the land as empty or virgin, or at least not used to its fullest potential by Indigenous peoples. And terra nullius, and that brings us back to exploration, lands considered empty. And what are those lands? And what are those histories? So often the places, even today, that we consider as interesting for exploration, not in an extractive sense, but as a let's go out and see what's out there sense, are those lands that are still seen somehow as unoccupied. But if you look at the land of the globe, there's an article by David Weaver stating that 5% of the world's population is indigenous, according to the United Nations Population Fund. But 5%, right? But they are the majority group of about 1/2 of the world's land area. 1/2 of the world's land area is what we would consider indigenous. Those land areas are often the site of exploration. So the Arctic, the Sahara Desert, South and Central America, Australia, Oceania, Sub-Saharan Africa, Southern and Southeast Asia. That vast, unbounded place you hope to explore, that I hope to explore, people, unless we're talking about Antarctica, have probably lived there and made it a home and had stories and understandings and pathways upon that land. And so, how do we, myself as a settler, move and explore in the right sense of the word, travel and seek without replicating the wrongs that we've inherited? And on to decolonialization. The steps toward decolonialization are laid out differently by different people. It ranges from dismantling colonial governments to, quote, engaging the activities of creating, restoring, birthing, restoring cultural practices, thinking, beliefs, and values that were taken away or abandoned. That clearly is a very brief gloss of a complicated subject. And there's a huge range of what decolonialization can mean in a physical sense. And I hope you'll all pursue the teachings that are out there to learn more. And I'll provide some references at the end of the talk. But I want to return and come back now to how this intersects with the exploration narrative and how writers, myself as a writer, can do the good work necessary to move forward into new and better territory when we're writing about our travels beyond the place that we call home. I don't see your faces, so I can't say, are you with me? But hopefully you are. And then hopefully there'll be questions later on. So let's talk about some other voices. I think it's a really good practice for me to decolonialize my own exploration narratives by beginning by reading Indigenous writers who engage the lands that we visit, to investigate and be open to narratives that are embodied in people and in the land that might be different from those who travel there without historic ties. So I want to quote some contemporary Indigenous poets, novelists, and memoirists whose work I really admire and who are actively writing about both connection to and displacement from their indigeneity. And I'm going to focus again on the North, on Alaska in particular, because the people and the lands there are those I'm most familiar with. And the writings that I'm going to talk to shift for us an idea of exploration, and that's so important. So the first two writers, Joan Neviap Kane and Gigi Ukpik, they're both Indigenous Alaska writers who do not live on their ancestral lands, and their work, each of them, explores the distance from and the search for that connection, an awareness of how they are both Indigenous writers, and yet they are not Indigenous writers writing from a place in which they grew up on the lands that they were home to originally. So for Joan Kane, in Milk Black Carbon, which is a book put out by University of Pittsburgh Press, and also in her chapbook, The Straits, referring to the Bering Straits, she investigates how she can map her return to King Island, an island in Alaska, in the northern Alaska, that her family is home to. And that her mother did not grow up on. Her mother was displaced from, Joan herself was displaced from. But how can you return to a place? And what does that mean to return to a place that you don't have a bodily memory of? So here's a quote from Joan. I'm going to show the screen. Uh-oh, hold on, it's coming. So this is from Iridan, from Milk Black Carbon. A coastline, a transitional place, bears evidence of others' dwelling. A house pit in the shape of a nest, another like a knife, a noose not lost in time. Ours, a useful relationship, though not a tight one, for between us we knew there was something to lose. And I don't want to spend time deconstructing or analyzing her poem, but I really encourage you all to read her work and to think about her complex interweavings of place, self, family, and time. The next poem I want to mention is Gigi Ukpik's poem, A Ricochet Harpoon Thrown Through Space and Time. I'm sorry, let me say that again. A ricochet harpoon thrown through time-space. And this is from her book, Corpse Whale. And the book is so interesting because in the book, there's a way that Gigi foregrounds herself as someone distant from the land of Alaska, where her ancestors are from, and also a self who kind of exists there in history. So she uses this interesting split pronoun, this I, she. This is I, but also she. I am this thing, but also strangely, I'm not this thing. And the she I identity within the book is a way to hold on to belonging and not belonging, to here and there. Who is she and who is I? We're not really told in the book, but the split is what's important. The poet Arthur Z., who wrote the introduction to Corpse Whale, says, our experience of time moves from linear to synchronous. Why does time need to be linear? Past, future, and present coexist. And this simultaneity is key to Okpik's poems, which are both personal and objective, both first person and third person, embodying the ways in which the self can be split. I'm so fascinated by this acknowledgement of what one desires to be and what one is distant from in her work. And this is just another way to view place and self and how you embody the stories of each. So here's a brief quote from the poem I mentioned before by D.G. Okpik. She is, I am, bound to thrive even in a desert of sand. Will you not diffuse or possess Hermai tact or sit poised on Hermai glacier, watching it become a reflecting pool? She, I, tamps Hermai pipe, savors the sun's energy and learn to ricochet Hermai harpoon, time dilation, slowing down 23,000 miles per hour, stretching out of time. So again, that self-other, how do we understand a place that is ours is not ours, and the way this demonstrates that split is so fascinating and meaningful to me. And then there's the memoirist and nonfiction writer Ernestine Hayes of Juneau, Alaska. And unlike Joan Kane and D.G. Okpik, she does live in what is called Tlingit where she grew up, Southeast Alaska, the land of the Tlingit people. And her book, Blonde Indian, which is a memoir, chronicles the journey of her departure from Juneau, where she grew up as a kid, to California, and her hard-won return to Juneau and to her identity as an Indigenous Tlingit woman. And it's a complicated, nuanced interweaving of peoples, non-human beings, past and present, idealized characters, and lived memory. And it offers a testimony to the violence of settler colonialism in Alaska, and also a pathway toward repair. And I can't recommend it highly enough. And let me just read this brief quote from Blonde Indian. In a way, I am like the woman who married a bear. I too was gone for a long, long time. And when I came back, I too was a stranger. Years have passed since I came back home. The gentle mountains embrace me. The channel is again at my feet. I hear the winter wind telling me things that only my grandfather knows. Remember who you are. Hold on. And then finally, although he's not an Indigenous writer, I also want to mention Seth Kantner, whose semi-autobiographical novel, Ordinary Wolves, is a really interesting counter-narrative, or I don't want to say parallel, but a side narrative to these stories. But in it, the protagonist, Katak, is a white kid raised traditionally within a Native community, as was Kantner. And Katak knows he's a settler, yet when he travels from the village to Anchorage, land of white Alaska, he's displaced too. He feels out of place, as many Native peoples do when they come from the village to the city. And the book really is a wonderful way for settlers, for outsiders to consider whiteness in a northern community, to consider indigeneity from a different perspective. And here's a small quote from the book from when Katak goes to Anchorage to visit basically a shopping mall called the Diamond Mall. At Diamond Mall, I locked my bike to a light pole, pulled the wrinkles out of my jeans, and strode into America. I moved along, longing for someone to invite me home for soup, the way people in the bush invited a stranger in, though that was beginning to seem as likely as a caribou following me home to bee soup. So then there's aside from these indigenous people that we follow to places that we love and that we should read about places we love. And for me, that mapping is toward the north. So this is why you've got these northern examples. But then there's the settler traveler and the settler writer from away, which is what they call people from outside in Newfoundland. And this is where I fit in, and maybe where some of you might as well. So how do we create new stories? How can our writing avoid the lazy paths of colonizing narratives and form new allyships? How might we challenge and shift those stories? And while it's a small gesture toward all the work that has to be done, I want to use myself as an example because I've been trying to do this and I think I have a lot more work to do, but these are the ways that I've tried. And specifically in Toward Antarctica, I write about my work as a naturalist guide on eco-tour ships, as I said, in Antarctica. And again, Antarctica does not have the settler legacy of the Arctic, but it still has a colonial one in its interest in nationalism and resources. And there are hero narratives aplenty set on the ice in Antarctica. But there are a few ways in Toward Antarctica that I try and challenge and complicate the hero narrative, and that maybe serve as a little bit of a guidepost toward moving your own writing, our own writing, towards something that subverts that exploration narrative and moves towards something more interesting. And I try and write from my own particularity as a woman in this long manned place, as a queer woman in this historically straight space, and in the images in the book that I include, which I showed you at the beginning of this talk, that are not perfect and that are not heroic or National Geographic images, and deliberately so, just to think about looking at that place from a different perspective. But here are some thoughts about how we might move into a different exploration narrative, and how we might try and undercut that colonialist impulse that's in so much of that work. So in Toward Antarctica, here are some things that I tried to do. First, in Toward Antarctica, the story is not about a solo adventure, but it really centers on a crew member who is part of a complicated team. So taking the I out of things, right? Mentioning logistics and crew dramas. And, you know, in traditional exploration narratives, the I is so heroic, but the I, that voyage is never taken without others, hardly ever. Whether it's you get on a plane to get somewhere or you're part of a team going somewhere, why not make those others present? Their role will not mitigate your wonder, your curiosity, or bravery. And it will only underscore the relationship of self to place. Next, the main character of Toward Antarctica, me, is flawed and nervous, sometimes uncertain. And I think we see that in some older narratives, in exploration narratives, but I think seeking a self-reflexivity that's more conscious, more critical, and more overt is really important. And why not let the gap between your knowing and not knowing be part of the narrative? You don't need to be sure. And that's not, well, we'll get to that in a second. I would also say that I think a good way of decolonializing this narrative is to not avoid the structures of capitalism and the market forces of tourism that are part of your voyage, the logistics of travel. Bring those to the forefront. Disinfectant bins, bus tours, champagne toasts, indemnity waivers. we all get there, wherever there is somehow. And maybe it's airlines or hostels, maybe it's family relations or a friend of a friend of a friend. But what if that is part of the story? And what if you acknowledge the economic inequities that are part of our lives as travelers? Are you more privileged or less than the people you're talking with? Who holds what power and where? Let those logistics show. Why not? I would also say that I think it's really important to challenge the following red flag statements. No one has set foot, remote, uncharted, out of time. I don't believe any of those statements about anywhere. Those are easy statements. Don't use them. Why are you using them? What are they trying to say about your relationship to that place? Dig a little deeper. Also, invite other voices and stories from the past to be part of the experience and understanding of your experience. Whether that's friends, historic figures, your own younger self, all of those have things to offer. Your moment in that place is not apart from time. Let that intersect with time. Explore how that conversation also resonates through things you've read and lived and heard. And we all have teachers and ancestors, ones we gratefully follow and ones we push against. Allow them into the conversation. Embrace what I call responsible befuddlement. And I don't mean like the, wow, I didn't know that. The OG of not knowing something as an excuse, like coming back and saying, I had no idea that bears were aggressive. Come on, that's irresponsible. But responsible befuddlement and unknowing in a deliberate way can be a really powerful way of representing one's experience of a place. So rather than moving directly into naming, codifying, explaining, offering facts, staying in the moment in which you're just experiencing things, listening, looking, smelling, that can be a really wonderful moment of pushing it against the tidy categorization of experience that becomes a little bit easy. So this idea of responsible befuddlement, allowing yourself to be unknowing without being irresponsible, I think is a really great way to pull away that colonializing safety net of knowledge. And then finally, beware of beginnings and endings. When does a story begin? When does it end? It's not when you arrive in a place and when you leave a place, right? There's all the lead up of the work you do to begin to arrive somewhere. There's all of the processing and thinking that you do after you've left a place. That's also part of the journey, the conversations you have afterwards. And I think the ways that things surge back in memory or whisper forward in dream can kind of counteract this very compartmentalized idea of exploration as something that happens out there and not something that's part of a greater life. I'm almost done. So Toward Antarctica came out last year, and now I'm looking ahead to the next project. And I'm thinking about how I can do more and how I can do better, what I didn't do right there. And for a long time, I've mentioned the North, and I've lived in Alaska, not as long as many people, but for a time, for about 5 years. And I've been really interested in the Arctic. It's a place that I'm drawn to. I don't know why. I found it incredibly fascinating and beautiful. And I'm also really wary of the snarl of a white settler engaging with the history and natural history of the Arctic. It's pretty daunting. So, yet the place calls me, and my memories of my time working and being in the Arctic call me. So, what do I do about that? And how do I honestly engage and embody what my mind dictates and what my heart pulls toward? There's an amazing writer, Leanne Simpson, and she has a couple of books, Islands of Decolonial Love and of Being Lost. But in her essay, Land as Pedagogy, she says, meaning is not derived through content or data or even theory in a Western context, which by nature is decontextualized knowledge, but through a compassionate web of interdependent relationships that are different and valuable because of that difference. Individuals carry the responsibility for generating meaning within their own lives. They carry the responsibility for engaging their minds, bodies, and spirits in a practice of generating meaning. So, how do we generate meaning? I've tried to find my way to figure that out in my time in the Arctic. And I think I've found it maybe through a historical foil, which seems right and allows the balance of love and doubt that I think have to be part of this project. So there's this guy, Donald B. McMillan. He was born on Cape Cod, where I live now. And he ended up spending his life sailing in the Arctic, spending time up in the Arctic. He died in 1972, which was the year after I was born. And I've been reading his books, articles, and journals, and I'm interested in interweaving his experiences and mine, looking at his experiences and mine, all the political shifts that have happened between us, charting the fissures between us, bringing to light the ways his presence in the Arctic has enacted colonial paradigms, and how my own does too, honestly. So in my time working in the Eastern Canadian Arctic, which I've loved, along Baffin Island into Resolute, one of the companies I worked for was Native owned, and we had young people aboard who we worked with who were there from villages in Nunavut, the northeastern province in Canada, who were curious to see if they might want to spend more time with tourists, bridging their worlds and ours. And I think so much about what I learned from them. Ostensibly, I was there to teach them how to do what I do, but really they had so much to teach me about how they saw and engaged with the land that we were with, the water and the land. And I think that has to be part of the story. Listening and learning and being open to different lives and priorities, decisions that are not totally dominated by Western capitalism necessarily. So I want to end with two poems that I hope are moving toward this complex acknowledgement of self, history, and subject that I'm trying to advocate here. And then I hope you'll have some questions, even though it's getting late, I know. So the first poem is titled Southern Music for Arctic explorer Donald B. McMillan. And when I say Southern, I mean south of the Arctic. And for any of you who have heard throat singing, whether it's Tuvan throat singing or traditional throat singing from the Arctic, it's a pretty amazing music making. Throat singing is something done by women, between women. It's something that's done mostly in winter, inside, as a way to entertain the self and maybe also the kids. It's not something that men are invited to do. It's a competition. It's a friendly competition, and something that McMillan would have witnessed. His wife, Miriam, traveled with him to the Arctic. She was 30 years his junior, but that's another story. Southern music. The choir on stage facing the audience, not turned to each other, no interrupting laughter. You, in plush seat, aware of money paid and thus how much attention is due. Voices drawn through thin pipes and shaped in the mouth's nave, not growl deep in sound. How blank their faces, stiff their silk, how fixed to notes arranged by some distant, unrelated hand. You drift, Miriam nudges, but she's impatient too. Your records from Greenland are rough, warped. I don't believe you made them just for science. Home, I bet you stood with Miriam on your polar bear rug, fire cracking in the hearth, hands on each other's elbows, eyes on each other's eyes, and opened your throats, sound surging like water between you. I bet you allowed yourself the comfort of breath as well as breath's outrush becoming song. Mac, you filled your body with the sounds of women at least once, didn't you? And then this final poem, again for Macmillan, is called Pursuit, and it's set in Provincetown on Cape Cod. And again, Donald B. Macmillan, this explorer, Macmillan Pier, which still is in the town where I live, is named after Macmillan. And I guess what I say here is true, and that's all I need to say. Pursuit. All summer, town kids pose at the edge of the pier named after you and leap. I've just flown home from Baffin, Mac. A month of spotting polar bears, lecturing on tundra as raw wind shrugged us off, then winter chased us down the coast. But it's still season here, and so I'm at the gangway, loading a boat to look for whales. Boys dash between pickups, girls strut the edge, do the same. No one throws coins for them. But I know you jump for the bright glint tourists through, and I'm sure for the thrill of being watched do it. These kids leap to break the hot September days, and because tonight they might find themselves recorded by some out-of-towner's gadget and posted online for view count or currency, their comment, their currency. Would I have strutted, have jumped at their age, yours then? I can't decide. At high tide, their knees are eye level from my place on the finger pier. One girl wears a silver bikini. It shines like ice on the horizon. I can't help but stare. Suddenly, I see it is desire that links us, that galvanizes the thin substance of our ambitions. So, thank you for listening. I know I've talked a long time, and I'm really curious if you have questions. I don't want to hold you too late, but I promise to be brief in my answers if you do have them.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth, for that enlightening reading and talk. So I'm going to open it up, as Elizabeth mentioned, for the Q&A. So audience, please send your questions in via YouTube chat. And while you're composing your question and chatting in, I want to begin with a question of my own. Elizabeth, in Toward Antarctica, I think it's in the preface, you state that though the book is drawn from personal experience, and you just alluded to that the main character is you say you wouldn't call it nonfiction or memoir. And as we heard tonight, much of the book is interspersed with diary-like prose, along with photos that document your experience, informative, and what I found delightful footnotes, as well as haiku.
I love footnotes.
Yes, they were wonderful. You know, they were so enjoyable to read. And so could you talk about this in more detail? In some ways, this is a book that defies that characterization, as you've talked about. Is your hesitation to call it nonfiction also a necessary process of decolonizing the exploration narrative?
Oh, that's a great question. And I think the reason I don't want to call it nonfiction is that I think poetry often gets labeled nonfiction or truth before it's stated as such. It's assumed to be autobiographical or memoiristic. And for me, there's my lived truth, and then there's the truth of the poem. And I never want my writing to be held as much to live truth as to the truth that I discover in writing, what I'm interested in exploring. So every bit of writing, mm, autobiographical or not, you're shaping things and bringing some things to the fore and tamping other stuff down. So I suppose I wanted in that introduction to emphasize that crafting and to emphasize that what I was putting forward was a particular version of my experience and not my whole experience, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Because yeah.
No, go ahead. I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, I mean, I think that's the short answer, but I think if I keep going, I'm not going to say much more that's interesting about that.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. We do have a question from the audience. What and or who are you reading today?
Oh, well, I am reading today. I'm reading Nikki Finney's new book, Love Child Hotbed. What's the whole title? I can't remember right now. I'm going to look it up on my phone. It's so great. I love Nikki Finney as a poet. I'm also reading this this old reprint of a book about a British naturalist following a river otter, and this kind of beautiful Tanaka, the river otter exploration that a friend gave me. I'm reading Evan Boland's um, A Journey with Two Maps, kind of talking about her discovery of herself through herself as a poet in Ireland. And I am eagerly awaiting the arrival of a couple of books. So I usually have a few books going at the same time, nonfiction, poetry, fiction, and then the New Yorker just keeps coming and coming and coming. But that Nikki Finney book, I'm really loving it. And I'm sorry that it's the Love Child, blah, 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 blah. I can't remember the whole title of it now. It's her new book, and it's got images and poems and these also these hotbed stories that are galvanizing moments in her life for poetic and political awareness that are so great. So that's what I'm reading right now.
Great, thank you. Okay, another question. Many of your suggestions for decolonizing narrative seems to be calling for a reimagining of the basics of narrative away from the individual experience toward a group experience. Could you further explain your ideas on how to do this effectively without losing the personal point of view?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think even if you're getting in your car and going somewhere by yourself, you're not really by yourself, right? You're with the stories you bring with you, you're with the people you encounter on the way. And I think that classic exploration narratives, John Muir, for example, they erase even Wallace Stegner, even Wendell Berry. He's not really an explorer, but still, this idea of there's an idealized version of being alone and communing with the other or the elsewhere, and really, very few of us do that. And why do we not, or why do we doubt the validity of our experiences if they're not wholly solo? What's behind that? Is it some kind of weird American by the bootstraps thing? I know that I rely on the teachings of my friends and my family. I rely on the kindness of strangers. I rely on the logistics of things that I've read. I think that especially now, especially if you're traveling with a phone in your pocket, you are not traveling on your own. And what's so great about being on your own? You can have solitude and investigation and wonder in a way that feels individual without being solitary. Or I'm not against solitude, but I just think that we erase a lot of the logistics that help us get places when we write about stories sometimes. I think about, say, John Haynes and his poems about Alaska. He wasn't by himself, he had wives. Wendell Berry, too. His wife is typing up all of his manuscripts. Thoreau, his mom did his laundry, all of those things. Like, why do we erase those connections with others, even in our narratives of solitude? Why not let that complexity, I am alone and yet I'm not alone, be part of the narrative? I think that that's important. And why are we so interested in solitude? I think so much about working with the young folks who I've worked with in the North, especially, and the different set of values. Not let me go away and earn my own, but how do I be part of my community? I don't think that the individual exploration and the individual manifest destiny is a universal good. And I think that's a cultural construct. So let's think about that a little bit. What if the social web was the most important thing? What if it was a strange thing to go out on your own? Maybe just decenter that that I narrative. What might happen then?
Great, thank you. Another question. Sitting with decolonialism is often a painful experience. Can you talk about your relationship to pain, discomfort in this work? Do you have suggestions for students or teachers doing this work?
Yeah, that's a great question also. And I think especially coming around to the fact of saying, all right, for me, I'm a settler. I didn't do anything. I was just born, but here I am. And my ancestry puts me in that place, right? Um, and being willing to admit that and think about what that means, and um, what I owe in gratitude and in service and in debt for my place on this planet. And I think a lot of what I owe is really to do some work about learning who my ancestors have supplanted. And I turn a lot to the writings of Robin Wall Kimmerer, and I was going to quote her as I was talking today. I think about braiding sweetgrass quite a bit, but I also think about her essay Wendigo, which was collected in Dear America, an anthology of letters of hope, defiance, and democracy. And in it, she says, you know, shoot, let me look for it right now as we talk, because it's such a wonderful quote. She says that colonists become ancestors too, right? Ancestry is not only the cachet of people who are indigenous to a land. Colonists become ancestors too. And the question is, what kind of ancestor do you want to be? And for me, that's such a welcome and generous and generative spot to begin to think about. All right, this is who I am, but what do I want my legacy to be? And how do I fully know and understand the history of the land that I occupy? And what do I want to do in my own lifetime to be part of that conversation? How do I want that conversation to evolve? I think that's where the most fruitful work can be done. Is that an answer to the question? I hope so.
I think so, absolutely. Um, Another question is, raised in the military, I find myself not anchored to any location. How can I begin to find a sense of place here in the Pacific Northwest, particularly in my nonfiction creative writing?
Oh, that's a great question. I mean, I am, as I said before, I'm a wash ashore, which is the term for people who did not grow up on Cape Cod, which is where I live now. And also, I think of David Gessner, who's a creative nonfiction writer, and he has an essay. It's a great essay called "Being a Polygamist of Place," kind of challenging that idea that you must be raised in a place, from a place at all, to be able to embrace place. And I think there's a strength in that, sure. I wouldn't say there isn't, but I think also that if you come to love a place and really embrace it and investigate it, that is a really powerful act of knowing. And do that. Be a polygamist of place. I mean, personally, I feel my homes, like the places that have influenced me, Cape Cod, um, Seattle, Tacoma, the Salish Sea, also Alaska, also more peripherally, the high latitudes. Like those are places that I really hold dear to me. And some of them I've earned from being born there and spent years and years. And some of them, there's this connection that I can't I can't justify by time, but I feel it. And so I think my work is to try and earn it by reading, listening, attending, and offering my view as knowledgeably as I can of that place. And I think that's what I would encourage anyone who doesn't feel rooted to a single place to do.
Thank you. And there's one last question. How do you feel our current situation with the pandemic affects our ability to narrate from a group experience perspective? How do you feel we can continue to connect on a meaningful level?
The pandemic. Well, it's made us all think really creatively, right? About how and when we connect. I know that I connect with my parents. We play games over Zoom. Rather than just having phone calls, we've been seeking out different routes. But I think, oh God, I hope it's temporary. But I think there are a couple of things. I know that I personally don't see people deliberately because they're in nursing homes or they're vulnerable in certain ways, and I don't want to put them at risk. And I think really carefully about the risk that I'll bring to people. And I think about the people that I miss and that I want to be in touch with and how to do that safely. Um, I don't know how it's going to affect us in the long term. I'll be really curious to see. But I think all of those things, like the people we choose to trust and the people that I don't know, I have a friend who is immune compromised, and it's really important for me to be able to see her. So there's a lot of stuff I don't do so that I can see her, right? So that I won't infect her. Um, and I think a lot of us are making these decisions about our risk, the risk of what we'll bring to other people. And it's sorrowful, but maybe it makes us think a lot more about the dynamics of our connection also, um, and how we care for one another. I don't know. I don't want to be a Pollyanna, but I do think that it's been fascinating to think materially about contact tracing, right? My touching this person, my going to the grocery store, the post office, inviting this person into my home means that I touch all these other people. And that's a scary and vector kind of conversation, but it's also an interesting social thought. Like, how many people are we in touch with? And how many people who um, share our beliefs or who don't. And I found that a really fascinating when I can pull back from the realities of worrying about getting someone sick or myself sick or my partner sick. A really interesting idea about dynamics um, and how we intersect with one another's lives.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Elizabeth. Um, so it doesn't look as if there are any more questions. So, and it's 8:20, it's much later where you are. So I think we will start to close now. And just before we do so, I'd like to extend my thanks to Kate Laws for her introduction, and also to Kimberly Tolson for managing our YouTube page. And finally, though it is still months away, I want you all to think about something to look forward to, which is Friday, March 12th of 2021. Poet and essayist Leah Purpura will be presenting our next Stegner lecture, also via YouTube live stream. And more information about this event will be forthcoming next semester from the Humanities Division. Thank you so much again, Elizabeth, for such a wonderful talk and reading. Much appreciated. Thank you all for attending. Good night, and please stay safe.
And please, if you have questions, I'd be happy to answer by email. So please pass on my email to folks. This was a delight, and thank you for having me.